Okay, hello. Um, I have some new markers, which hopefully will work better. And I ordered a new easel, but it didn't come yet, so my board might collapse again in the middle. And with that, um, so what I'm planning to talk about today is um, mostly the structure and contents of the system that Carnap actually sets up. Um, Aiming towards next time being able to finally address head on that question of like what is important to Carnap in this book? What's he trying to do? Um, so uh so one part about that is the actual basis that he chooses. So I'm going to talk about that first, the elementary experiences. Then there's kind of the overall structure of the system. Now, like I didn't assign you to read most of the details of the system, but most of the details aren't that important, and I'll discuss why not. The overall structure is kind of important, and then I'm going to zero in especially on this one stage where Carnap is introducing physical objects. I mean, it's both a key stage from Carnap's point of view in the system, right, where he leaves the auto-psychological sphere and moves to an external sphere, right? So it's, I mean, it's a key stage from almost any point of view. If I was stuck with my own experiences, then this construction system wouldn't be on course to include every concept we need for empirical science. Obviously, I have to be able to somehow make that jump. Um, and it's important because Husserl thinks that jump is like a huge discontinuity, the greatest gulf there could possibly be between different spheres of being, or something like that. Uh, Carnap wants to show that it's actually just a matter of applying the same technique of construction we've already been doing. It's also important because we're going to see that Quine says this is the point where the Aufbau project uh, evidently fails on its own terms. And he's going to claim that not just the Aufbau, but logical positivism in general is implicated here. Okay, so that's what I'm going to talk about at the end. But so now I'm going to go back to the elementary experiences. Um, just a little bit without knocking anything over. All right. Right. So the actual basis that's selected is what in English here is called the basis of elementary experiences. This is or in German, uh, elementare Erlebnisse. So this term here, Erlebnis, means experience. Um, it's uh, not the term in Kant that's translated as experience. Oh, I just noticed that I knocked some letters off the end of that. Um, right, the term in Kant that's translated as experience is Erfahrung. Erfahrung means it's right, it contains fahren, which is well, in contemporary German usually means to drive, like to drive a car. Um, so, but it's a cognate of the English word fare, or as in like farewell, right? So it means to like go out and, you know, kind of fare along, right? um, so Erfahrung is experience in the sense of like process of learning that you go out and do. Um, I'm very experienced. Uh, is that sense of experience. Erlebnis, which is a later German, right? It didn't even exist in German in Kant's time. It comes from the verb leben, which means to live, and it means experience in the sense of something you have. Like I had an interesting experience. That's Erlebnis. Um, um, this is not so important a point in Carnap because he doesn't use Erfahrung for anything important in this book. He just uses Erlebnis to mean experiences. So there's just a hint towards what we mean by experiences here, basically. Um, we'll see that in uh, Popper in German does make a distinction between Erlebnis and Erfahrung and like bases a lot on it and then gives up on it in English and just has to translate both as experience. So, um, and I guess I should add one more thing, which is Erlebnis is a very important term in Husserl. So again, I keep kind of slipping in this narrative that's not really relevant to this course, so I probably shouldn't. But the extent of the influence of Husserl on Carnap. Okay, in any case, so what are these elementary experiences? So Carnap says that it would be tempting to take as the basis of the system kind of simple components of experiences. And this both helps, knowing what the simple components are, both helps explain what the elementary experiences are supposed to be, and like how it's supposed to be related to more familiar things. So uh, Carnap says, and this is in section 67, it's like the bottom of page 107, top of page 108. He says that a lot of people following Mach, um, Mach is the most important of the people who are called positivists, as opposed to logical positivists, right? It's an older school of positivism. So a lot of people, Carnap says, following Mach have taken the basis to be things like simple sensations, right? So, what would be an example of a simple sensation? It would be like a certain color seen at a certain position in the visual field at a certain time. That's like a simple sensation, or a certain note heard, and perhaps you should add in a certain direction, although Carnap wouldn't probably add that, but a certain note heard at a certain time is a simple sensation. So um, it's tempting, Carnap says, to take those as the basis of the system. So that would be a basis in, like, so to speak, sense data, understood as these little pieces of information. And Carnap adds, and more generally, things like that, right? Because he's thinking not only are there other senses, but there's other things that go on, like pieces of thought or something like that. There's other similar, simple constituents. And you might think, let's start with those, and we'll build everything up on the basis of that. But he says, And my document camera is not working, I just realized. So I'm not going to show this to you in the book, but I'll just read it. Again, this part is on page 108, I think. However, upon closer inspection, we realize that in this case, we do not take the given as it is, but abstractions from it. That is, something epistemically secondary as basic elements. Right, so he's saying that these simple constituents are not what's immediately given. We know them by abstraction, based on what is immediately given. So, right, abstraction here means, um, and this, I guess, is like technically what abstraction always should mean, but it's not the way philosophers often use it now. So it's worth emphasizing. So abstraction basically means that you ignore part of something and focus your attention on another part. It's really the same word as subtraction, basically. Um, right, with ab rather than sub, but it basically means the same thing. Like you take part of it away, you take part of it out and consider just that. Right. So the idea is that in our actual experience is not composed of these individual points of information, but is actually composed of wholes that come all at once. And that's what we know immediately. And then it's only by um, abstraction, that is, by carefully paying attention to one part of that whole and not the rest, that we come to the idea of these constituents that are simpler. So it takes a further epistemic step, so to speak, right? We know immediately these wholes that make up our entire consciousness at a certain time. And then by some kind of further step of like analyzing them into parts, we come to know that there are these simple constituents. Um, and Carnap seems to think that this is a result of empirical psychology, right? He in particular refers to this kind of famous school of Gestalt psychology. So Gestalt in German. Well, I knew this was going to happen. Gestalt in German actually means shape. It's one of the words for shape. Um, and it's because the Gestalt psychologists, one of their main examples was the idea that you see a shape as a whole first. You don't see all the parts of its outline, right? Like if you see a circle, what you first see is a circle. And then if you want, you could focus in on the pieces, like segments or points of its circumference that it's made up out of. And they had, yeah, empirical evidence to this effect. The truth is, Gestalt psychologists didn't invent this idea. The older, uh, um, um, it's an idea that came up in 19th century British empiricism. Some like Thomas Brown and other places like that. And those people didn't have experiments; they just had introspection. um, but anyway, I don't think Carnap's aware of that, and so he thinks of this as a recent result of empirical psychology. It turns out that we see wholes first. or we are conscious of wholes first and then only afterwards by a further process of their pieces. And so we're going to take our basis as these wholes. So each one is the entire content of consciousness at a single point. Now, I mean, that's interesting. Like that's an interesting idea. It's not really Carnap's idea, right? I mean, he doesn't even say it's his idea. It's an interesting idea about what our consciousness is like, or something like that. What's interesting in it from Carnap's point of view, or from the point of view of understanding Carnap, is more like, what does this abstraction actually mean? Um, So at this point, he's going to split it up into the way we would talk about it in our ordinary language and the way the constructional system is going to describe it. Right? This is where he introduces those little p and little c symbols, like little as quotes, you know. So you would write like abstraction with little p's around it. So the p stands for psychological. And the um, because the particular piece of our ordinary way of talking about things that we're interested in is psychology, right? When we talk about people and their consciousness ordinarily, and right, I don't have this system has an auto psychological basis. I guess I should have emphasized this. It's my elementar Erlebnisse, my elementary experiences that are being chosen as the basis, not everyone's in general. Carnap says you could have a system like that too. You know, that would be a good constructional system. But for our purposes, like what's epistemically primary to me is my elementary experiences. Other people's elementary experiences aren't empirically primary at all, right? I only know them on the basis of like my experience of their bodies. Right. Uh, but like our ordinary realistic language, as Carnap puts it, right? Our language where we describe a world full of things and how they behave is doesn't have separate words for autopsychological and heteropsychological experiences. It doesn't have a separate part for those, right? It has, you know, one thing called psychology that talks about what experiences are like. Um, and and that one thing called psychology thinks of these wholes as having parts that we don't notice to begin with. That's why they're not epistemically primary, but it has those parts, right? So when we start discussing this between the little p's, we're going to say between the little p's, in my consciousness, at every time there's a whole composed of parts that I haven't noticed yet. And that in order to notice, I have to perform the operation of abstraction. But, um, and that's not wrong. In fact, it's so far from wrong that it's a test of the constructional system that in the end, I'll be able to translate that into a sentence that's true in the constructional system. Right? That's one of the psychology is one of the things that are have to going to be they're going to have to be built up as the constructional system goes on. And if I don't get back what we like the ordinary concepts and theorems, so to speak, right? Empirical theorems, empirical results of psychology, then there's something wrong with the constructional system. So that way of talking between P's is not wrong, but on the other hand, obviously we can't presuppose it at the beginning of the constructional system. Rather, we're going to have to construct it, right? So between little c's, we don't say any of that. Between little c's, we say the basis falls in a certain relation list, and that's all we say about it. Or in what Carnap calls the language of fictitious constructions, we're going to assume that our subject A, Carnap calls the subject A, right? That our subject A, who has, remember, has finished all their experience. They're not going to have any more experiences. Now they're just like looking over the record or like protocol or at a protocol. We're going to see more about protocols soon. A protocol is like a notebook where you take minutes of a meeting or like record observations in a lab, right? So they're looking back over the protocol of everything they've ever experienced and following certain instructions in order to construct objects. And what's written in their protocol is basically um, uh, a list of pairs of numbers. So every number is the number of one of the elementary experiences. Um, that is, it's right. Every one of those numbers, I can say between the P symbols, refers to one of those elementary experiences that psychology says is in me. Between the C symbols, we can't really say that, except as the definition of elementary experience, right? An elementary experience is something that's named by one of these numbers. So, I mean, so all we have is a list of um, pairs of numbers. And that list of pairs is the pairs that belong to the relation extension of the basic relation. Now, I haven't said what the basic relation is yet, but there's one basic relation. And what our subject A is given is a list of pairs for which the basic relation holds. Right? So you remember like a relation like successor of, so S, and actually, so usually nowadays we would write a relation like this, S, X, Y. That means the relation pulls between X and Y. And therefore, if we wanted to write a relation extension, although people don't usually talk about relation extensions anymore, you might write it like this. Um, Carnap, and this has no significance really. I'm just explaining it because it might otherwise be confusing. Carnap will write the relation symbol between the two members of the pair, right? But one way or the other, this is going to mean X is a natural number and is the successor of Y, is the number that comes after Y, right? So now, I mean, as Carnap thinks about it, this is a propositional function. So I can supply two things, one for X and one for Y in that order, and this will give me a proposition. So I can put in, like, let's say, 1 and 2, and this will give me the proposition 1 is the successor of 2. That's a false proposition, but it's a perfectly good proposition. It's just false, right? 1 is not the successor of 2. On the other hand, I can give 2 and 1, and then I get the proposition 2 is the successor of 1, and that's a true proposition. And the relation extension is basically like all the pairs that give you a true proposition, right? So it's going to contain 2 comma 1, 3 comma 2, 4 comma 3, etc. So now in the constructional system, the basic relation, it's called remembered similarity, is, and it's written, at least in the English Aufbau, it's written like this. Um, so, um, so this is a propositional function. Give it two elementary experiences, and it gives you a proposition. X is remembered to be similar to Y or something like that. Or should it be the other way around? I forget which way he does it, but in any case, um, I think it means actually, I remember Y to be similar to X. Okay, but so, if I plug in, now we assume, again, for the purpose of the language of fictitious construction, we assume I have a name for every one of my experiences, an arbitrary name, and Carnap says, why not just have it be a number? That, by the way, tells you how many elementary experiences I could have, right? I mean, at most, I could have as many as there are natural numbers. But he seems to be thinking there's finitely many, actually, from other things he says about it elsewhere. Um, which is relevant to some issues between Carnap and Quine and various issues, right? He seems to be thinking there's finitely many of these. It was later pointed out, actually, by Nelson Goodman that some of his constructions don't work at all if there's only finitely many. Like at some key point, he refers to something called the topological dimension of a certain relation, and Goodman points out that if that will always be zero if it's finite. So anyway, never mind that. So we have a propositional function. I can plug in the numbers that are names of two elementary experiences, and it will give me either true or false. And the relation extension contains all the pairs that make it true. And so what our subject of fictitious constructions is given is the list that makes up this relation extension. That is a list of pairs of numbers. And just on the basis of that, the subject is going to have to be able to get, well, first of all, somehow to these individual simple pieces. So, I mean, that's not going to work by saying, oh, so experience number 1277, look at it and you'll see it has these pieces, right? Like that, from the point of view, in the language of fictitious constructions, I can say that information isn't given. All I'm given is basically what I can find out is, you know, when was this experience, like, when was some other experience remembered to be similar to it, and when was it remembered to be similar to some other experience? And even that, I'm supplying the meaning of this relation as remembered to be similar. That should go in P's, right? That's like psychological talk. What I really know is just that that this experience occurs in certain pairs in a relation extension of the basic relation. How am I going to get abstraction? I can't literally do abstraction here. Now, again, this doesn't mean within the P's, like from the point of view of psychology, that I don't really perform abstraction in this step. Like in terms of what actually goes on in my head, who knows? That's an empirical question and, it's complicated, right? But it means that the constructional system can't explain this step by a process of abstraction. Rather, it has to use, and I didn't assign, there's many, many sections about this, what I didn't assign, and I'm just gonna like briefly allude to the way it works. It's Carnap calls the process quasi-abstraction. And it works essentially by like, so in this remembered similarity, buried in it is a relation of similarity, period. So the first step is to get that by like basically like um taking all the pairs and their opposites, right? So it's everything where one was remembered as similar to the other, one way or the other. Those are the things that I know are similar. And then you say basically, well, a bunch of things that are all similar to each other have something in common. So you form these similarity classes. And if you do that right, some of these similarity classes are going to be, we would say within the P symbols, we would say these are classes of experiences that all have a sensation of red in such and such a point of the visual field. Right? So this class would be the class of all the experiences that have red at such and such a point in the visual field. Meanwhile, there are other classes, right? Like this class might be all the ones that have a sensation of a certain tone in a certain direction. So this is going to be very difficult, especially because similarity is not transitive necessarily, right? So like A can be similar to B and B can be similar to C, but C isn't similar to A. Um, so and these classes overlap and whatever. And in fact, the way Carnap tries to do it, that's part of what Goodman is focusing on in that objection that I mentioned, that in fact, the way Carnap tries to do it won't work for various reasons. So that right away is one reason it's not worth going into all the details here. I mean, uh, it can't be that important in the long run because it doesn't even really work exactly this way. And yet Carnap doesn't think unlike Quine, doesn't think the whole project failed. So therefore, he must not care that much about the technical details. And he says that himself in various places, right? So, yet, nevertheless, it's important, I think, or at least worth knowing how this is supposed to work. I mean, I think it gets, for one thing, gets into a way of thinking that helps understand what happens in Goodman and Quine later. Um, right. So this process of quasi-abstraction, and you can see how you might think, and maybe it still could be fixed up. Like Goodman is still trying to fix it up in various ways. David Lewis later tried to fix it up in other ways. That, yeah, somehow, if you do this right, you'll end up with a set of classes of elementary experiences, each one of which can be called a color or a color at a certain point at a certain time. And that will be the constructive definition of that, right? So even though within the P's, we would say that color at that time is one of the constituents out of which this experience and a bunch of others are made, right? They're wholes that consist of parts, one of which is this color at this time, at this place. Maybe I shouldn't say time, this color at this place. Um, but within the C's, we're going to say definition, this color at this place equals the class of experiences that are similar to each other in the following way. Where the following way doesn't refer to colors or places or anything, right? It just refers to the structure of this relation, basically. That's the idea. That's the way we're supposed to proceed. And Carnap, although as I say, he misses certain details, and therefore that way he does it won't work exactly. He does like carry this out for the very early stages of the system in the symbolic mathematical language, which is the official language of the construction system, step by step. And again, I didn't assign these sections, but you can look for them. They're there, and each one begins with a constructive definition written out in the official symbolism, and then a paraphrase in the language of fictitious constructive operations, and then another paraphrase in the realistic language. And it goes up to the introduction of things like the visual sense, right? So the visual sense is defined as a certain class of classes of relation extensions, et cetera, of these elementary experiences. Um, and that's the last thing that he does in all that detail. Okay, there's only like, well, counting Terry, there's two people here who might have questions. Let me stop to see if either of you has any questions on your own behalf or on behalf of the other people who are hopefully going to watch this as a recording. Or other people. By the way, I went to Trader Joe's this morning and um, I got to the like checkout counter and the guy says, looks at me and says, "You know, I was recently looking for information about the philosopher Otto Neurath, and like was searching for lectures. I thought maybe I could find something on YouTube, and you were the first thing that turned up." It's like, wow, I'm like famous. Do you want my autograph? Anyway, um, all right, but there are no questions, so I'll just
I just
yeah.
have one
Oh,
comment. I think because you were saying that at least in the first edition of the Aufbau, he wants elementary experiences to be the basis. Um, I accidentally read the what is it, the preface for the second edition.
right, which is the only thing that was changed for the second edition, right? He didn't actually
Yeah.
re-edit the book, he just added a preface. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that he says that he, at that point in time, is more willing, or I think he might even say that he switched over to Mach's elements of perception. So that's just a note that he might
Yeah.
have changed camps on that one.
Yeah, I think, I mean, and we'll see actually in the uh so usually I teach this course, we see two later stages of Carnap. This time, because of Veterans Day, we're only going to see one later stage of Carnap. But that one later stage of Carnap is going to be enough to see that he's, later on is willing to depart from this type of basis in much more fundamental ways. Um, but yeah, so in 1960, whenever it was, he wrote that preface, the second edition. He said, "Yeah, if I were to do a project like this again, I think it might be better to start with a mock style basis." Yeah. And I mean, again, that's, that type of comment later is important because it shows, at least from the later point of view, what he thought was crucial in the earlier stuff and what he thought could change, could be changed for convenience or because it's realized it really would be a better place to start or, for various reasons. Um, with and have it still be a version of the same project, right? So that means if he thinks later, at least, that you could have changed that but still be a version of the same project, then you can see that although this is really interesting, at least later he didn't think it was essential to the project, right? He thought that, yeah, you could, um, suppose you decide that those mock style simple components are a more convenient basis. Why? Maybe now you think those are epistemically primary. Maybe you've realized that what counts as epistemically primary is really relative to a point of view. Maybe you have new results of empirical psychology, even although I don't think that's what drove any of this development, but in principle, it could be, right? So in that case, you would start the system with this basis, but it's still the same project. So that's a good question, actually. Um, and yeah, there's no reason not to read other parts that I haven't assigned, except that you might not have time to read them. But other than that, it's great. Um, all right. So that's the basic stage of the system. That is the auto-psychological sphere as far as he develops it. Um, As for the rest of the system, as I said, I didn't assign most of it. Now, why? Well, I mean, for one thing, we could spend the whole quarter reading this one book, but that wouldn't be an introduction to philosophy of science. That'd be an introduction to Carnap's Aufbau, right? So, uh, but moreover, as I said, and here's one point, this is in section 157 on page 246. Since the given constructional system is only a preliminary outline, we do not wish to base the following considerations upon details of the system, but only upon its character as a whole. Right? That introduces all the discussion of problems of essence and whatever. Right? So what he's saying there is, the details of the system are still not really worked out. We might want to change a lot of them, and a lot of them haven't been filled in at all. So, as we go on to discuss the implications of this project for other stuff, like, for example, and I think this is really important from Carnap's point of view, but it's certainly crucially important for this course, right? Like, if we want to just go on to discuss other subjects, like, for example, the relationship between philosophy and science, we're not going to base it on the details of the system, but just on its overall character. Um, and the overall character, you know, as he puts it in section 157, that does include the overall structure, right? The overall structure. I mean, I think I've said this in passing various times, but it might be worth writing it out. Um, Even though, again, it is one of those details that we'll see that he pretty quickly like loses interest. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that. It comes back in other ways later on. So maybe he never really gives up on this exactly. But anyway, it goes like this. There's autopsychological, physical, heteropsychological, and cultural. Where cultural, so um, cultural translates geistlich, right? This word Geist in German is hard to translate into English. Um, so first of all, it's a cognate of the English word ghost, and sometimes it means ghost. But usually it's translated as spirit. Um, so just as the English word ghost, right? Like you can hear in the phrase Holy Ghost, that the English word ghost used to be interchangeable with spirit. Right. So like uh so it can mean spiritual. Um, but what we call the social sciences and in large part what we call the humanities in German is called are called the Geisteswissenschaften, the spiritual sciences. Right. So there, obviously, spirit is kind of a weird translation. And that's why they went with cultural, even though cultural is not really translation at all. Right. Like it does, this Geist doesn't mean culture. Um, but so like there's a number of different things going together here. Um, is it worth spending time on them? I'm interested in it, so I'm going to say a little bit about it. I mean, like, on the one hand, we have, um, So remember, I said the idea of spheres of being is actually an ancient Neoplatonic idea. Um, and um, in ancient Neoplatonism, and this comes from something Plato says in the Laws, although like whether he actually means, he probably doesn't mean it this way, but like in ancient Neoplatonism, the most important three spheres of being are nature, right, or in Greek, physis, so the natural or physical sphere, um, which is literally a sphere, right? Like it's contained in the sphere of the heavens. There's the natural or physical sphere, and then there's this above that. There's a sphere of soul or psyche, right? So that's this sphere here, and then above that there's a sphere of intellect, nous. So, I mean, nous probably really shouldn't be translated Geist, but it did get translated as Geist. I mean, in particular, Hegel treats nous and Geist as equivalents. Um, and, in the part of his system called the philosophy of spirit or philosophy of Geist, you know, it ends with a quote from Aristotle about the divine nous that intelligizes itself. So, so here we have basically reproduced the three ancient spheres of being. Now, I don't think Carnap got this directly from reading uh, Plotinus or something. My sound is breaking up. Is it back? Am I back?
Yeah, it seems like it's back.
Okay.
Yes.
Um, it
It's
is the
just
pro.
difficult to hear what you said in the last couple of sentences.
So which did you hear when I said these here we have the three ancient spheres of being?
Yes.
Yeah. And then all I said after that is I don't think Carnap got this literally from reading Plotinus. Um, I think, it came by way of Brentano and like it doesn't matter exactly, but it is interesting that it persists right into the Aufbau. Because this is in no way a coincidence. I mean, the immediate source is probably Husserl for Carnap again, but that it doesn't matter that much. So that's one thing that's going on here. On the other hand, Carnap is also interested in the relationship between the sciences of physics, psychology, and what we would call the social sciences. This is a problem that was especially raised by Dilthey, who Carnap mentioned several times. Whether there's a fundamental difference in method between the Geisteswissenschaften and the natural sciences, and which side psychology should go on, or is psychology get split, right? I mean, there's some echo of that debate in the fact that we still have a distinction between social psychology and empirical psychology or something like that. Um, So Carnap is interested in working that out. And in particular, the way he's interested in working that out is, as I said last time, in showing that each of these sciences, yes, does have its own special realm, so to speak, sphere of being that has nothing to do with the others. And yet they're all unified. There is no fundamental discontinuity, difference of method, etc. Um, and the grounding in the auto-psychological, I mean, that could also be I mean, this corresponds to Husserl's realm of pure consciousness, which contains Erlebnisse. um, but uh, um, it doesn't correspond to an actual science, obviously, right? There is no science of auto-psychology, and in some sense couldn't be a science of auto-psychology. I mean, Husserl thinks there can be a science of of this in effect, but uh, he ends up concluding that it can't be taught. That in later Husserl, which I think Carnap is partly responding to, that it can't be taught, that all I can do is kind of hint to you. You have to perform the phenomenological reduction yourself. So it's very mystical and whatever. And again, Carnap wants to get as far away from that as possible. This is just part of the same system. There's no discontinuity. We can get from one to the other. And a test of whether we've done this part right is that we get the right things here. Um, okay, another thing about the overall character of the system is the importance, and I mean, I guess I've already been talking about this, but I'll focus on it more closely, the importance of reduction. Um, what reduction means here and which part of that is really important to Carnap. So, I mean, I already talked about this last time and maybe even the time before, but I'll, say it again. Reduction here means that in principle, every sentence that's used in these cultural sciences can be translated into a sentence about my fundamental experiences. And if it's right that there's finitely many of them, that's pretty extreme, right? Like it means when I say, uh, well, let's not take one of those highfalutin examples from the cultural sciences, but just something simple from this level, like there's a black table in front of me. It's not really a table, but whatever. Some kind of item of furniture that my computer's on. But anyway, I say there's a black table in front of me. Um, that means some definite thing about all the experiences I will ever have, which is a finite class of experiences. Um, it means that, some relation, some derivative of the fundamental relation has the following structure. Some precise derivative of the fundamental relation that I can explain has the following structure. And so that means that in that finite class of all the experiences that I'll have, a certain thing is true about which ones are remembered to be similar to others. Um, and in some sense, all the content of my sentence, there's a black table in front of me, is included in that complicated description of how that those finite experiences are related to each other. In some sense, right? Like Carnap will say, well, I don't have the same kind of images or Vorstellungen as representations. I think the way he's using Vorstellung here is he may get this from Frege, actually, but he's using it to mean or it's kind of a Hegelian use of it, actually, but I don't think it comes from Hegel. But in any case, that Vorstellung is like kind of imagery, right? So like when I assert one sentence, I have the following kind of imagery, emotional associations, whatever, and it would be very different if I asserted that other sentence, that really complicated one about remembered similarity. Um, but as far as the truth value goes, they're the same. And they're guaranteed to be the same because one is a translation of the other. Um, that's the sense, like in later analytic philosophy, when we talk about sentences uh, being synonymous because they have the same truth value, a lot of times people add something like they have the same truth value at every possible world, right? They necessarily have the same truth value. Because otherwise, like, this is a pen and this is my nose have the same truth value, but they're not the same sentence. Right. But at this stage, Carnap's not talking about any stuff like that. Later, he does talk about stuff like that, but at this stage, he's not. But there's still a necessity to it. The necessity is due to the convention of our language, right? Like it's because we've defined our terms in such a way that one of these sentences is a translation of the other. That's why they have the same truth value. So they're guaranteed to have the same truth value. They necessarily have the same truth value. It's a logical truth that they have the same truth value. Right. So, I mean, why am I saying that's so radical? Well, because you might think there's an infinite number of ways you could check whether there's a black table in front of me. And even like an infinity that's bigger than the infinity of the natural numbers. If you don't know what I mean by that, just ignore that, right? But because to check for sure that it's really a black table, I would have to look at it from every point of view, every possible point of view, and make sure it looks right, looks like a table, not just from here, but from all over, right? And also I'd have to check how it behaves as time goes on and how it responds to the other senses, right? Like suppose um, I mean, other senses, that is, I guess I should have said, and you don't only have to check by looking at it. You have to check with the other senses too. You have to check whether my hand will go through it. When if I do this with my hand and it looks like a black table, but my hand goes straight through it, then I'm going to say, I'm not going to be willing to accept um, the sentence, there's a black table in front of me. I'm going to say there was a hologram, a hallucination, something like that, right? So it seems like an infinitely open task to determine whether there's a black table in front of me. And like that's what Husserl says about it, among other people. Um, uh, Carnap at this stage, and this is called like strict verificationism, is going to say that no, I must mean my sentence in such a way that in principle, a finite number of observations that I actually am going to make would be enough to decide it one way or the other. So the real translation will involve something like if when all the evidence is in, it favors the black table being here. This is what we say between the P symbols, right? Like this is what we're trying to get the constructive definition to do the same thing as. If when all the evidence is in for my whole life, everything that's relevant points to there being a black table here, that's what I mean when I say there's a black table here. I don't mean any more than that because I couldn't mean any more than that. Um, because it would be irresponsible to try to mean more than that. Because to mean more than that would to mean something that I can't ever back up by my observations. Right? So that's strict verificationism. And the form of reduction or going the other direction, the constructional forms, right, that we allow in this system are supposed to ensure that strict verificationism holds. So every sentence that I can say in my language I'm going to be able to translate it into something that in principle could be checked in a finite time against all the finite number of observations I ever will make. And that's going to decide whether it's true or false. So that's a very strong requirement. And what Carnap and other logical positivists are going to decide very soon after this, like by 1930, right? So, or by 1931 or 32, or like in a few years space, at the most. They pretty much all decide that that's too strict a requirement. Why is it too strict a requirement? I mean, you can impose this requirement if you want. The problem, they conclude that it's going to end up ruling out a lot of things we actually want to say in science, that they won't be constructible in a system like this. So, of course, you might think the conclusion to that should be, well, I mean, I guess here's two conclusions you might think follow from that. Number one, you might say, oh, so we've discovered that a lot of science is illegitimate, right? Like scientists are saying more than they have a right to say. Something like that, like Kuhn is going to describe a position he calls positivism that basically means that. Um, right? That uh, like um, when Ptolemaic astronomers said uh, the sun goes around the earth, they were saying more than their observations really could back up. And they should have just said the sun looks to a certain level of approximation like it's going around the earth from our point of view so far, right? And then if they had said that, they wouldn't have been wrong, right? Like uh, later developments didn't show that that's false. It's true to a certain level of accuracy. It looks like the sun is going around the earth in a circle, whatever. Um, so, so that's one way you might think of responding to this. Another way you might think of responding to this is, oh, so I see this project of logical positivism or of like a constructive system of science or whatever is a failure because it's not able to construct all the things that we need in science. Now, I mean, that's closer to the way Carnap looks at it because again, because as expected, based on what he says he's doing, right? It's the results of science are a test for the system, not vice versa. So from that point of view, you might think you'd say, oh, our system has failed the test. And then look, like I guess this isn't going to work because, we wanted to show that science was unified by using this strict criterion of verifiability. It didn't work. So I guess science isn't unified that way. And who knows, we'll have to, maybe we should be Kantians or I don't know, right? So, or Husserlians or Neoplatonists or something. But no, he doesn't say either of those. He says, oh, well, we have to allow a certain slightly different, looser criterion of constructability. And then we can still show that science is unified. And as time goes on, that criterion becomes looser and looser. Um, so in the end, he has something like um, and again, unfortunately, this in this iteration of the course, we aren't going to read the paper where he says this, but in the end, he ends up with something like science like has a whole complicated structure that in itself contains no reference to our observations at all. Right? It's an axiomatized system, but it's based on like the axioms of general relativity, or I mean, this means you have to axiomatize general relativity, which is one thing Carnap was interested in doing. Um, but it's interesting. It's based on the axioms of general relativity and quantum mechanics or something like that, right? And the axioms of arithmetic, and we build up this whole thing. And then where does the so like that accomplishes the unity of science, but then what makes that at all empirical? And the answer is, well, at certain specific points, we have a way of going back and forth between that theoretical language of science and a completely separate language that describes our lived experience, an observation language. And even there, the observation language is probably going to have a basis in statements about physical things, not my elementary experience. So it's contain things like there's a red sphere on the table, stuff like that. Right. So the becomes very loose, and yet Carnap feels like that's a successor of this project, and he's still doing what he wanted to do. Only now he realizes you have to do it more carefully with this looser criteria. Yes, John.
Um, oh, what was I going Oh, what's the name of that paper that we're not reading this semester?
Um, Maybe I should put it up on Canvas in case you want to read it. It's called The Methodological Character of Theoretical Concepts. I think I got all the terms in the right place there. Something like that. Um, yeah, I can put that up if you're interested. I mean, or you can find it
Yeah.
by Googling it or whatever.
So it's the methodological character of theoretical concepts.
Yeah, I wouldn't swear to that.
Okay.
Let me see. It's easy for me to check. Let me look at a previous iteration of this course. Yeah. Yeah, the methodological character of theoretical concepts. Um, that's probably one of the latest endpoints of this development. Um, but so I'm emphasizing this now. I'm not going to say more about this because I want to get onto the construction of the physical world. But uh, once again, you can see from that something about at least looking back later what Carnap thought was essential to this project. And I mean, as I've already emphasized before, I think you could, from a certain point of view, at least, you could see why he would think that strict verificationism isn't really that important. And the reason is because strict verificationism, yes, means that in principle you can do this. But remember how I kept beating, I'll beat this dead horse once again, you know, that like in principle doesn't mean really. You couldn't really do it. Right? In real life, if you take a statement like, I don't know, the climate is warming due to human carbon dioxide emissions. So, you know, like to go through my elementary experiences, all the ones I'm ever going to have, and figure out, so to speak, on which side the evidence is. That's impossible. It's impossible for multiple reasons, right? It's not even close to possible. It's impossible because I haven't had all my experiences yet, because I don't remember all the ones I had, because I can't keep track of individual experiences. And on top of all of that, because what I need to check is unbelievably complicated and there's no way I could do it, right? So all strict verificationism means in practice is that at each one of these levels, we have like a prescription for checking it against a lower level, which we can't completely fulfill, but we can collect some of the evidence that would go into it. Right? So all it means in practice is just that, yeah, somehow our observations have bearing on whether the theory is justified or not. And I think like that's what Carnap thinks is still present in that, even in that latest version. Um, okay, that's all I want to say about that because I do want to go in most years I don't get to this at all and it's very bad. So I'm going to get to it right now. Um, because I assigned these sections, I think they're pretty difficult to understand and yet they're important and Quine is going to allude back to them. So this was sections like 194 to 199. Or no, it's pages 194 to 199. It's like sections 126, 127, whatever. Um, so to understand what Carnap is trying to do here, um, consider first of all the problem that you solve in writing the renderer for a video game. Now, I mean, a pretty simple-minded one, right? So, like, a good example would be my favorite, but really only video game I play, which is Minecraft. Although even the old-fashioned, like, simple graphics version of Minecraft is still more sophisticated than what Carnap has in mind here, because it includes like light sources and whatever. Right? Carnap introduces the visual world without mentioning light sources, which, of course, if there were no light sources, everything in the visual field would be black. Right? So, but never mind that. So what's the problem you're trying to solve? So basically, you have a description of the world which consists of these shapes. In Minecraft, they're mostly cubes, but not all cubes. It consists of these shapes, and at each point on the surface of each shape, you have a color. This is what you have stored, so to speak, right? And you have it stored in the computer as a list of numbers, just the way Carnap imagines this situation, right? Like you have coordinates, like 3 or 4 dimensional coordinates, a point in space and a time. And for each one, you have a number that represents a certain color. And you have one more piece of information, which is the point of view of the player, right? The player is going to be our fictitious subject A. So you know where the player is, and although Carnap doesn't really mention this, but he should mention this, what direction the player is looking. um, and so this this square here is supposed to be like the screen, right? So the screen is the player's visual field. Not really, right? But the screen is like simulates the player's visual field. And your problem is, given this description of colors in space, fill in the spaces on this visual field to give the picture that the player would see from this point of view. And then you have to make it change appropriately as the player moves, and these shapes mostly stay where they are, but sometimes move around and sometimes change color and whatever. Um, and how do you do it? Well, you say, like, you draw a line in your 3 dimensional space. And of course, drawing a line means, because again, you don't really, there isn't inside the computer, there isn't really a space with little blocks in it, right? There's a list of numbers. And drawing a line means basically like figuring out what is the linear equation that whose solutions include this point and this point, right? So you draw the line that connects this point with the player's point of view, and you see where it intersects the screen, and you fill in that point in the screen with that color. Now, again, even in Minecraft, there's something more sophisticated than that, right? Because like you have the sides of the cube are like shaded if they're turned away from you, or and they're brighter or darker depending on how close they are to the light or whatever. But Carnap is ignoring all of that. So like on Carnap's version of this, we just take this color and we put it on the screen there, um, wherever my gaze intercepts the screen, so to speak, right? And you know, I look at some other point, there's some little angle between the two lines that corresponds to a certain distance apart on this screen. And then we follow them out here, and it corresponds to some point that's in another place, right? And where that point is going to depend on where this other line hits a body, right? Like it might be, if there's a body here, then that other point might be pretty far away from this point. And then we do the same thing. We figure out what color is here and we put it on the screen. And by doing that for all the points, for all the directions I can look, um, so since the screen only has a finite number of pixels, there's only a finite number of directions I can look, and we go through them all and fill them in with colors. Okay, so far so good. However, and so this problem is like, I mean, it's not that difficult. Um, um, Here's a much more difficult problem. Suppose all I have is a record of what the player saw on the screen at each time as the game went on. Now I have to, from that, I have to figure out what the player's point of view was at each time and what color was, what bodies there were and what color there was at each point on their surface. Last time I gave this course, someone told me that this is known as the inverse optics problem in some field. I guess computer graphics, I'm not sure. But anyway, so obviously this is a much harder problem. I mean, in some sense, it's an impossible problem. Why, in some senses, is it impossible? Because there's many different distributions of bodies and movements of the point of view relative to the bodies that would result in the same history of screens. Right? I mean, because all you have to do is like put this point much farther away. um, Now there's no surface of a body here. There's a surface of a body here, and yet you get the same color there. So there's two different distributions of body that are consistent with the same distribution of colors on the screen. And in fact, I think it should be clear from just that one example, there's infinitely many different, right? Like it's not just a couple. You can basically put points at any distance in those directions you want, and you get some weird shaped surface that produces the same colors on the screen, right? So, so if we're going to solve this problem at all, we need certain constraints on what the distribution of bodies can be like and how the point of view can move relative to the bodies. And in section 127, Carnap describes what those constraints are using the realistic language. Right? So he says, we're going to assume that the point of view moves continuously. It doesn't jump around. We're going to assume as much as possible that, and then there's a whole list of things like that, bodies don't uh, change color that much, that bodies don't move that fast, that bodies stick together, that they maintain the same relationship between their points as they move, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I mean, you have to add as much as possible, right? Because if you say that those criteria have to be completely fulfilled, meaning that, for example, the bodies don't move or change color at all, then even though there are a lot of possible solutions to that, that won't be one of them, right? Like there isn't any way to move continuously through an unchanging uh, world of unchanging colored surfaces that produces just any pattern you want. In order to get the pattern of changes on the screen that you actually see, you have to allow these bodies to move somewhat, to hide each other, to turn around, to change shape, to change color, right? Like when you use a dye on a sheep, its wool changes color in Minecraft. And like you have to allow some exceptions to these rules, but the idea is that you want to make those exceptions as little as possible. So you want to make this basically as coherent and stable a world of bodies as possible with a continuous and not too quickly moving point of view. And then, although in the Aufbau it's the other way around, because right, what I just said is the description of it from the point of view of section 127, the realistic language. But then go back and say, and we're going to use that as the constructive definition of what? Well, basically the five place relation. I forget what Carnap calls this. I think he has a name for it, but call it like AC, like assigned color, right? So it has five places because it has an X, Y, Z, T, and a color. I just changed my notation for relations, I guess, by putting those parentheses and commas in, right? Like if I wrote it the same way I did before, I should have written like AC. Oh, this is falling again. AC, X, Y, Z, T, Z, like that. Right? So a relation extension of this relation is very complicated. It's a list of ordered quintuplets, but it's still the same kind of thing as we were talking about before. Right? We would put like little X hat, Y hat, T hat, Z hat, and we would have a relation extension. So we want to introduce this relation by a constructive definition. And all we have to begin with is like so to begin with, by Aristotle in the system, what we're supposed to have is a three-dimensional description of the visual field, right? So we have like a, you know, actually, let's use different letters for this just to keep it clear. Right? If these are coordinates on the screen or the visual field, right? This is R and this is S, then we know at every time what color is in each one of these positions on the visual field. That's what we have to start out with. And we want to somehow use that to define this. So, and the approach is to build these constraints into the definition. Right? So the definition is going to be, and I think it's almost like it's easier to understand this as just one big step rather than the detailed way that Carnap does it in section 126. Because in section 126, Carnap says, you know, there's going to be colors at certain, so I mean, maybe this needs another place because, or maybe the color sometimes is zero to represent that there's no color there, right? Most points in visual space aren't going to get a color. We're assuming that the medium is transparent and homogeneous and whatever. We're making a lot of very simplifying assumptions, which again emphasizes how preliminary this discussion is. And yet you're supposed to be able to see from it how you could do something like this in principle. So, um, and that's, you know, that's not implausible, right? Like if you think like of the step that goes from graphics in Minecraft to graphics in, I don't know, like Halo or like, I don't know, one of these really fancy video games, right? Where the graphics are really good, Grand Theft Auto or something, right? I mean, it's still the same idea. There's just a lot more complicated machinery built in, basically. You have to figure out how light bounces around between these different objects, how it makes reflections and shadows and all that stuff, right? But it's still basically the same idea. And now we would want to take that more complicated machinery and reverse it. That would be the real way to do it, right? So back to this, we're trying to reverse this simple machinery. So you know, Carnap, you know, says a color is going to be assigned to certain points at certain times. in such a way that the following things are true. And like this angle, if it's, will always be the same angle for any two points and the same 2 points in the visual field. And like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, a long list of steps, which you're supposed to be able to compare to the realistic language in section 127 and see what they come out to. But I think like I said, it may be more it may be easier to understand the definition, so to speak, in one step. Like it's going to be so in gee, let me make this be the name of the this is the name of the quasi object that we're constructing. The assigned color relation, right? And it's going to be defined as it's going to have all this R. It's it's going to be a relation that it's going to be a relation that satisfies the constraints relative to the actual visual field history. Right? So far what we're saying is if you use this as the assigned color relation, and if this is what was actually in the visual field at each time, then this will satisfy those constraints. So for example, it will, this should have been C. So for example, it will assign colors mostly to continuous surfaces that mostly move continuously, that don't change too much, et cetera, right? So it's going to satisfy those constraints. And I guess you have to say something like to within delta, right? Like, because it's not going to satisfy them perfectly. It's going to satisfy them to a certain degree. And the definition, the constructive definition of AC is going to be that AC, and now I'm going to introduce this symbol. I have 5 minutes left. Okay. So this is an upside down letter iota, the Greek letter iota upside down. It's called the definite description operator. Carnap uses in this book. It means the. So that is when this works, like let's say the X the X such that X is now the president of the US, right? So that means there is something that's the president of the US now, and there's only one of them. And X will be assigned that. Or sorry, I mean this whole thing means that one thing. The single thing that satisfies this description. I mean, it can go wrong. It can go wrong in two ways. One is if I change this to, and this is a famous example, if I change this to King of France, the X such that X is now the King of France. So it goes wrong because there is no King of France now, right? So there's nothing that satisfies the description. Or it can go wrong if we say X is now the senator from California. So there is something that's a senator from California, or I guess I should say is, right, it's because it's the X such that X is now a senator from California, is how to read that, right? So there is something that is now a senator from California, but unfortunately there are two. I mean, not unfortunately from a political point of view, but unfortunately from our point of view, because our definite description doesn't work, right? Like this doesn't mean Adam Schiff and it doesn't mean Alex Padilla. It doesn't because there's too many of them. So it doesn't mean anything, basically, or you have to deal with it somehow like that. This is why people, at least part of why people worry about introducing this definite description operator into logic. And like, if you take Phil 9 now, I'm pretty sure they not going to introduce the definite description operator. But if you look in Russell and Carnap and whatever in this period, you'll see the definite description operator all over the place. Um, and in particular, it's needed in a constructive definition like this, but it's needed even in very simple constructive definitions, right? Like if you wanted to define two in piano arithmetic, you have to define it as something like two is the x such that x is the successor of one. And in this case, you can be safe because you can prove that there is exactly one successor of one. So you can prove that it doesn't go wrong from the axioms of piano arithmetic. So the King of France and the senator from California problems can't happen. Yes.
So is he? I mean, I'm guessing that he's lifting this out of Russell's on denoting. Um, because it seems like the two issues that you brought up about the definite descriptor notation, or what's it called? The definite
The
descriptor
description operator.
operator. Yeah, it seems like he addresses both of those in on denoting.
Yeah, on denoting is part of Russell worrying about this idea of a definite description, um, which is not the first stage of the worry about it is in that paper, and then it continues to this day, right? So, but it's because Russell thinks that he understands how to deal with definite descriptions that he's happy with introducing a symbol for it in his logic, right? So, like in Principia Mathematica, where he tries to construct classical mathematics on the basis of logical axioms, he often will use this operator as part of it. So, I mean, yes, on denoting is the key to understanding how Russell thinks about that problem, what the resolution to it is. It's not as clear what Carnap thinks about it, and that's part of the problem with interpreting this book, and in particular whether this step is good or not, because he's going to say it's the R such that I don't know how to write this. Don't take this as an official notation or anything. I wrote like min delta here, right? It's the R that satisfies this best, right? Where delta is smallest, where delta measures how far off we are from satisfying all those constraints. So that's going to be the definition. So like leaving aside this business about the definite description operator, that looks like a perfectly good constructive definition. Well, you might worry about whether a finite number of experience, there might be some problems here, even before that. But in any case, right, you're just saying, like, all you're saying inside the parentheses is this relation R, whatever it is that best satisfies these constraints. But to go to the step of then defining this relation as the one that the one that best satisfies those constraints, you apparently need to prove that there is one and that there's only one. Right? There might not be one at all if there's a series that better and better satisfy the constraints, but there's no least upper bound of that series. So it just gets closer and closer to something. Or there might be more than one if there's a tie. Now, in the realistic language, or going back to the video game, that would mean that there's two equally stable, continuous worlds that are both consistent with the same history of visual fields. So it would mean that my visual history is really ambiguous. Right? It could just be as well interpreted as bodies this direction or as bodies that, something like that. The difference might be really minute or it might be huge. um, so, so the question is, what does Carnap think about that? He doesn't presumably think that you can prove that there's one best solution, as you can in the case of this definition of two. Does he mean, but we know from experience that there is one best solution because after all, we see one world and it's not ambiguous mostly. Sometimes it is, usually not. I'm not sure what to do about that. Sometimes it is, but that could probably be worked in somehow. Uh, so, I mean, we always resolve that in the end, right? Like we realize what we were really looking at. um, so, or do we say something like, we have faith that there'll be a way of doing this? Or is it just that Carnap didn't notice that there was an extra step here of proving something that he couldn't provide? And that therefore this wasn't really a good constructive definition after all. Those are the main alternatives, probably other alternatives. But anyway, so that's to keep that in mind for when because Quine is going to say the last one, basically. So we need to keep in mind whether that's plausible or not. Okay, sorry, I went over by 4 minutes. And I will be back in person in Santa Cruz on Thursday. So see you then. Bye.
Thank you.